In the valley town of Red Ridge, a bonfire of fleece burned high, sending black smoke into the gray sky, and the men were laughing down the dirt road. A woman drove a wagon piled high with the same raw wool they were destroying.
Still picking at your dead husband's flock, Mary? The wool's worthless.
She's like a magpie with a nest of rot. Can't let go of anything.
They never listened to Tom, but I will.
Years ago, her husband Tom had stood before these same men with a warning they refused to hear.
Wool is the only thing that'll keep you alive when winter comes hard.
The men had laughed then, just as they were laughing now.
He wasn't crazy. He just knew something they didn't.
She flicked the reins and drove home. The smoke of burning fleece at her back. The blight had killed the sheep in summer, and fever took Tom by autumn. Now Mary stood alone in the field where his flock had grazed, the memories of his voice still in her ears. Inside a worn ledger, in Tom's handwriting, "Wool is the only wall that stops moving air. Pack it tight and the cold can't get in."
That was his warning. Not craziness, just simple truth.
From the edge of the smoldering pit, she salvaged every armful of raw fleece the men hadn't yet burned.
They called it worthless. Tom called it life.
At the cold mountain stream, she washed the raw wool until her hands were raw and bleeding, the icy water turning them numb.
Not now, boy.
By nightfall, the clean fleece filled her wagon and spilled across the cabin floor, burying the bare boards beneath a cream-colored drift.
I'll finish what you started. I swear it.
The widow who couldn't let go was only beginning. At dawn, Mary wedged a wooden stick into the first wall gap and began forcing wool deep into the stone and log chinking.
Got enough fleece in there, Mary? You'll smother in your sleep under all that rot.
She's like a squirrel with a nut, except the nut's rotten.
They'll see, boy. They'll see.
She worked without pause, stuffing every crack and crevice, the wool bulging like insulation she'd seen in Tom's old diagrams. By midday, the ceiling rafters were jammed with fleece, and the floor gaps disappeared under thick packings.
Not one draft, not one whisper of wind.
Her hands bled through the cloth strips she'd wrapped around them.
Pain now means life later.
The cabin was becoming something no one in Red Ridge had ever built. A house sealed with the very thing they'd thrown away. She pressed the last handful of wool into the floor gap, packing it tight with frozen mud until no light shone through. When she raised a lantern to the wall, the smoke rose straight and undisturbed. No draft, no moving air.
Tom, it's like you said. No moving air.
That night, she carried a bundle of fleece to the darkened church, the key cold in her palm. Inside, by the thin light of a lantern, she began stuffing wool into the chinking between the old logs.
For everyone. Not just me.
As she locked the church door behind her, the first snowflakes began drifting down from the heavy sky. She hurried back to her cabin, where a single candle burned in the window, a beacon in the gathering storm.
It's starting, just like Tom said it would.
The widow, who had been laughed at, was now the only one ready for what was coming. By midnight, the storm arrived like a living thing, roaring over the ridge and swallowing the valley in white violence. Inside her cabin, Mary knitted by the fire. The flame held steady, no draft, no shudder, no cold whisper.
Still as a tomb. Just like Tom promised.
Through the window, the world had vanished into a howling sweep of white. No other cabin lights, no smoke, nothing.
Confound this cold. Fire won't catch, and the walls are sweating ice.
Harlan's cabin had turned into a frozen box. Frost climbed the logs, and the last ember had died hours ago.
Mama, I am so cold, I can't stop shaking.
In the Keller cabin, Martha wept over her boy, her breath a frozen cloud, the fire nothing but cold ash. Back in the wool-sealed cabin, her border collie pawed at the door and whined, but Mary did not move from her chair.
Not yet, boy. They won't come until they have no choice.
By the second day, no chimney smoke rose from any cabin. The valley lay buried under a white silence.
Moving air steals heat, Tom said so. They've burned everything by now.
She knew the Keller cabin by the bend in the road. No smoke rose from its chimney.
That boy, Peter. His cough was bad even in summer. In this cold, he won't last.
She put down her knitting, pulled on every wool layer, and wrapped her shawl tight. The border collie rushed to the door and planted himself before it, barking a sharp warning.
Stay, boy. I'll be back before the fire needs tending.
She nudged him aside, her hand firm but gentle, and gripped the iron door latch. The wind screamed as she cracked the door, snow blasting through the gap like needles. She gave the whining dog one last pat, pulled the door wide and faced the wall of white. She leaned against the wind, each step sinking to her thighs in powder, the Keller cabin a phantom shape ahead. She slammed against the door, and it burst inward, spilling her onto the floor with a gust of snow.
Mary, oh, thank God, he won't wake up. I can't get the fire to stay.
Mary pulled a handful of raw wool from her coat, pressed it into the cold ash, struck her flint, and breathed life into a tiny flame.
Your chinkings failed. Cold air's flooding in through a dozen gaps.
Frost had laced the log joints like white thread, a dozen seams leaking warmth faster than the little fire could give.
We can't stay here. I have a place. Wrap him in every blanket you've got.
Where there's no shelter standing in this storm.
Just trust me. Now move, or he won't make it.
She lifted the blanketed boy into her arms and plunged back through the door, Martha clutching her shawl and vanishing into the white behind her. But Mary did not turn toward her own cabin. She pushed through the drifts, past the blacksmith's cold forge, toward the dark steeple of the church.
The church? It'll be an icebox, colder than our cabin.
Mary didn't answer. She fumbled the key from her coat, shoved the heavy door open, and pushed Martha inside. Darkness swallowed them. The air was still, but cold as a tomb. Mary struck a match, and a single lantern bloomed to life. The light crept along the walls, and there, packed into every chink, every gap, was raw cream wool.
How? When did you all this wool?
Tom's plan. I finished it last month.
She didn't wait for more questions. She gathered kindling and a handful of wool scraps and fed the iron stove. A small flame caught, then grew, spilling warmth into the frozen sanctuary. Peter stirred in his mother's arms as the heat touched his face for the first time in 2 days.
It's so warm. Mama, I can feel my fingers.
Yes, my love. The fire is big now. Mary brought us here.
The boy's shivering finally ceased. A flush of life crept back into his pale cheeks, his lashes wet with melting frost.
Keep the stove burning. There's extra wool in the vestry. Use it if the fire sinks.
But you cannot go back out. You'll freeze before you reach another door.
Tom's plan was for every family. I won't let children die because the men were too stubborn to listen.
She pulled her shawl till the wool was hard against her ribs, then strode to the heavy door without a backward glance. The wind howled through the gap as she cracked it open, making the lantern flame shudder violently. Martha screamed her name in despair, but the blizzard snatched her voice and crushed it into silence. And then Mary was gone, a gray ghost vanishing into the wall of white, her body angled against the wind, fighting for every inch toward Harlan's house. She found Harlan's door half buried in drift and pounded with the flat of her fist until ice cracked from the frame.
You, what do you want? Come to watch us freeze?
The church. It's warm. I stuffed every wall with wool. Bring your family now.
Inside, the room was a frozen tomb. Elias hunched in the corner, his fingers blue, a child whimpering under a thin blanket.
She's serious, Harlan. Look at her. She's not gloating.
Harlan's jaw tightened, but the frost on his daughter's lips broke something in him.
Grab every blanket. Everyone follow the widow.
They stumbled into the storm, like the dead rising from a grave, a line of frozen souls clutching one another. Mary's shawl was the only point of color in the whiteout, a gray beacon pulling them forward. The men who had laughed now stumbled behind her, their pride frozen as deep as the river, but their legs carrying them toward the only warmth in the valley. When they reached the church, Mary shoved the heavy door wide. A wave of heat rolled out, steaming in the frozen air. They stumbled inside, shivering. Then they stopped, their breath catching at the sight of every wall, every rafter, every gap stuffed with cream wool.
She did all this while we were laughing. Wool in every crack.
Harlan's eyes swept the sanctuary, his mouth a hard line, but his frozen fingers slowly uncurled.
Put the children near the stove. Martha, is there broth?
Enough for all, thank God. Peter's even asking for seconds.
The men who had once burned fleece now huddled beneath it, their children wrapped in blankets they'd have thrown away. Outside, the blizzard screamed. Inside, the wool-stuffed walls held the heat like a banked furnace.
Tom, they're all here. You were right.
For the first time since the blizzard began, no one was laughing.
It ain't magic. This wool, it stops moving air. Tom always said, cold air moves, and moving air kills. Stop it, and you stop the freeze.
She didn't gloat. She taught. The faces around her, still blue with cold, lit with understanding. She told them how Tom had pleaded at the town hall, his voice carrying the same truth years ago, and no one had listened.
He knew winter would come like this one day. So I packed this church night after night because he wanted a place for everyone.
Harlan sat on a pew, his big hands limp on his knees, his eyes tracing the wool-packed rafters. He said nothing. A small girl coughed, and Mary crossed to her, tucking a fresh blanket of raw wool around her shoulders.
She did all this while we burned it, while we laughed.
The blizzard howled on, but inside the wool-sealed church, a fragile silence held, not peace, but a pause before reckoning.
We'll keep the fire fed and the wool tight. When the wind stops, we'll dig out together.
And for the first time, the people of Red Ridge understood that the widow they had mocked had been their only true neighbor. 2 more days passed inside the wool-wrapped church. The blizzard gave no quarter, and the stores of food and fuel dwindled to near nothing. On the 4th morning, a scratching came at the door. Elias opened it to find Mary's border collie, ice in its fur, whining pitifully. Mary, already weak, opened her arms, and the dog limped to her, curling at her feet like a promise. A voice from the shadows muttered, "Maybe she's the reason the flock died. Witchcraft."
Shut your mouth. She's the only reason your children are warm.
I'll rest when the wind stops. For now, keep the fire fed.
But when she rose to add a log, her legs buckled. She slumped against the wool-packed wall, the collie whining in sudden panic.
Mary, please, take some broth. You haven't eaten since yesterday.
The children need it more. I can wait.
The church fell silent, every soul aware that the woman who had saved them was now saved only by the wool she had packed with her own bleeding hands. On the 5th night, without any warning, the wind died. No howl, no shudder, just a vast, ringing silence. Inside the church, people held their breath, afraid to hope. Then Mary rose and opened the heavy door. A wall of motionless cold greeted them. Above, the sky was deep indigo, pierced by sharp stars. The blizzard had passed. The world it left behind was unrecognizable, drifts so deep they swallowed cabins to the eaves.
Mama, can we go home?
No one answered. The church was the only warm place still standing in the valley. Mary stepped out into the snow, her boots sinking, her breath a cloud. The valley was a frozen cathedral of white.
We'd all be dead without you and your wool.
Mary said nothing. Her face turned toward the buried valley, gave away neither triumph nor forgiveness. Behind her, the church glowed like a lantern of wool, the only light in a world erased by snow. By morning, shovels were found, and paths were carved through the drifts, revealing a world smothered in deep, pristine white. Harlan, his face lined with shame, found Mary alone near the stove, her hands wrapped in old bandages.
Your Tom, he was right. I called him a fool. I called you worse. But you saved my grandson.
Don't be sorry. Teach your sons. That's what Tom would have wanted.
I will. I swear it. And thank you from my whole family.
Tom knew. He just wanted you to listen.
Harlan took her bandaged hand in his. The first time a man in Red Ridge had held it without pulling away.
It was never about me. It was about the wool and him.
Outside, the villagers continued digging, unaware of the quiet change that had just passed between the widow and the man who once mocked her loudest. The valley still lay buried, but inside that wool-lined sanctuary, something frozen had finally begun to thaw. By the third day of digging, the sun broke through the clouds, turning the endless snow into fields of diamond light. A crowd gathered before the church, shovels in hand, as Mary stepped out with her collie at her side.
This woman stuffed wool into every crack while we burned it. 3 cheers for Mary Callahan.
The first huzzah was thin, uncertain, but the second rose louder, and the third shook the snow from the church rafters.
It was Tom's wool, not mine. Remember that.
The men who had once mocked her now touched their caps. Some looked down at their boots, unable to meet her eyes. Then Mary turned and walked away, her border collie bounding ahead, down the freshly dug path toward her cabin.
Now I can go home and sit with Tom's picture in peace.
The crowd parted for her, and for the first time, no one called her a crazy widow. The cabin waited for her, its wool-stuffed walls still holding the warmth of a long, hard fight. Mary pushed open the heavy cabin door, and the familiar scent of wool and wood smoke wrapped around her like an old shawl.
Still snug, not a crack loose.
She knelt to kindle a small fire, her movements slow but sure, and when the flame licked the dry wood, she finally let out the breath she had held for 5 days. From the stone mantel, she took Tom's photograph, the faded image of a kind, weathered man who had known this day would come.
They finally listened, Tom. Not until they had to, but they listened. We did it. You did it.
The border collie padded over and laid his head on her knee, a low whine in his throat.
I know, boy. We're home.
For the first time since Tom's fever, Mary Callahan sat in her wool-wrapped cabin and felt not grief, but something close to peace. Outside, the valley was still buried. But inside, the woman they'd laughed at had kept every promise she'd made. The days of digging were long, but as each cabin was freed, the lesson of the wool spread like a slow fire through the valley. Harlan, outside his rebuilt home, cursed as his wool fell loose from the chinking for the 3rd time that morning.
Twist it tight before you pack it, like this.
That's tighter than I figured. But it stays now, don't it?
Never thought I'd be grateful for sheep rot, but here we are. All of us.
She allowed herself a small smile, not of pride, but of a quiet, tired satisfaction. Children she had saved came running with small bundles of wool they'd scavenged from the melting drifts.
Thank you, little ones. Every bit will help keep some family warm next winter.
The church stood as a model, its wool-packed walls now a classroom where the men of Red Ridge learned the craft they had once mocked. And so the valley learned, their hands now busy with the wool they had once burned, their hearts heavy with the memory of the man who had warned them. One clear Sunday, the valley folk gathered in the church Not for prayer, but a town meeting on winter preparation.
Mary, would you tell us again, plain as you can, why wool?
Moving air kills. Still air saves. Wool is still air. That's all.
She held up a tuft and squeezed it in her palm. The children in the front row watched like it was a magic trick. When she let go, the wool sprang back, a pocket of still air trapped in every fiber. Adults scribbled notes on scraps of paper. Even the old skeptics leaned forward, their mouths set in concentration. Without another word, Mary placed the wool on a bench and returned to her seat beside Martha. There was no applause, only a deep, respectful silence settling over the church. The sound of a lesson finally learned. The widow, who was once called a hoarder, had become the valley's quiet teacher. Her lessons sewn into the walls of every home. And in the silence, Tom Callahan's warning, once lost in laughter, became the law of the land. Winter melted into spring, and spring gave way to autumn. But no cabin froze again. The wool held. Mary was seen walking the lanes with her collie, and now men tipped their hats instead of turning away. One evening, a small boy came running, clutching something in his fist. He pressed a carved wooden sheep into her palm, its edges worn smooth, and whispered, "Mama says for the warm."
Tell your mama, it's the finest sheep I ever had.
The boy disappeared into the dusk, and Mary walked on, the little carving resting in her pocket. Every autumn now, the valley gathered wool and packed their walls, a lesson no longer mocked. The laughter was gone. In its place, only the sound of thanks, spoken quietly as Mary passed by.
For you, Tom. It's all for you.
The widow who had been laughed at had become the quiet heart of Red Ridge. The wool her shield, Tom's memory her guide. By the next autumn, a simple stone stood beside the church, a carved sheep, and the words, "He spoke. We listen now." Mary visited it often, her collie always at her side. The wind, gentle now, and no longer cruel. She would stop and trace the carved letters with her finger, the only man who had ever believed her.
You were just before your time, Tom.
The collie would settle in the snow, patient as ever, his tail giving a slow thump. She never stayed long, just enough to feel the quiet and to know that he had been heard at last. And in the silence between winters, the valley learned to listen. Tom Callahan's warning was no longer a forgotten plea. It was the wool in every wall and the stone by the church. And the woman who had made it so? She just walked home, the dog at her heel, the carved sheep safe in her pocket. And so Red Ridge endured. At dusk, Mary Callahan sat on her porch, a tin mug of tea steaming in her hands, the collie's head heavy on her knee. When the next blizzard screamed down the valley, no one laughed. They had learned. The wool held, and the valley held, and the woman who had been mocked was now the quiet measure of a neighbor.
All that work, all that wool, worth it.
She looked out at the frozen peaks turning purple and gold in the last light.
Thank you, Tom.
The collie opened one eye, then closed it. Content. She stayed until the stars pricked the sky, then rose and went inside, the cabin's wool-stuffed walls, greeting her with the same steady warmth. The window glowed amber, a small square of light in the vast white world. And in that light, the widow who had been laughed at became the quiet legend of Red Ridge.